The morning Irene Abbott ran from her own wedding, the sky above Redemption Creek, Texas was the color of a bruise healing purple and gold and aching all at once. The kind of sky that looked like God himself was trying to decide whether to intervene. It was the spring of 1883, and the town of Redemption Creek sat in the flat, sun-scorched belly of West Texas like a coin dropped and forgotten by a traveler moving too fast to stop. The Comanche threat had quieted in recent years since the end of the Red River War, and the cattle drives had turned the region into something almost prosperous, almost being the operative word, because prosperity in Redemption Creek meant you had a roof that didn't leak and a horse that didn't bite. The railroad had come as far as Abilene, and the telegraph lines hummed along the main road into town, carrying messages that arrived too late to change anything important. Irene Abbott was 24 years old, and she had agreed to marry a man named Douglas Pratt largely because her father had told her she would. She stood at the back of the First Methodist Church of Redemption Creek in her mother's wedding dress, ivory cot, with pearl buttons running down the back like a spine, and she could hear the organ playing something plodding and slow, and she could smell the candle wax and the dried flowers, and she could feel something enormous and terrible rising in her chest like a flood coming up from underground. Douglas Pratt was 41 years old. He owned the dry goods store, the feed lot, and a significant portion of her father's debt. He had kind eyes in the way that certain snakes are considered beautiful, technically true, but inadvisable to trust. The Reverend was waiting at the altar. Her father, Gerald Abbott, was waiting at the back of the church to walk her down the aisle. He had his hat tucked under one arm and his face arranged into the expression of a man who had already decided how this day was going to go. "It's time," her father said quietly. Irene looked at the closed double doors of the church. Beyond them, she could hear the congregation settling into their pews, the scratch of boot heels, the rustle of Sunday dresses, the murmur of Redemption Creek's respectable families who had come to witness Gerald Abbott's daughter become Douglas Pratt's wife, and in doing so, discharge a debt that Gerald Abbott should never have accumulated in the first place. She thought about Douglas Pratt's hands, the way he had taken her arm at last Sunday's church social and held it just a little too firmly, the way he had spoken about the house he was building on the edge of town, a big house, he'd said, with a room for each of the children they would have, because he wanted sons and he wasn't shy about saying so. The way he had looked at her like she was a particular item he had ordered from a catalog and was checking to make sure it matched the description. "Irene," her father said, a warning in his voice now. "I cannot do this," she said. Her father blinked. "What? I cannot marry Douglas Pratt." The words came out of her very quietly and very steadily, like water finding its level. "I cannot do it, Papa. I am sorry about the debt. I am genuinely sorry, but I cannot stand at that altar and give myself to a man I do not love, and I will not." Gerald Abbott's face went through several colors in rapid succession. "Irene Abbott, you will walk through those doors right now, or so help me." But Irene was already moving, not toward the doors, away from them. She gathered her skirts in both hands and she turned and walked quickly through the side door of the vestibule and out into the bright Texas morning, and the door swung shut behind her with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. She had no plan. She had no money. She had no coat, and the morning was cool despite the promise of heat later in the day. She had her mother's wedding dress and her own 2 feet, and she had the absolute bone-deep certainty that whatever came next could not possibly be worse than what she had just left behind. The church sat on the northern end of Redemption Creek's main street. She went north, away from the town, her wedding dress gathering dust at the hem as she walked quickly along the dirt road that curved away from the buildings and out into the open Texas scrubland. She could hear, very faintly, the sound of the church doors opening behind her and voices raised in confusion, and she walked faster. The land out north of Redemption Creek was the kind of landscape that required a person to make their peace with it or go quietly mad. Flat in every direction, punctuated by scrub brush and mesquite trees and the occasional dramatic formation of red-brown rock. The sky was enormous. The silence, when you got far enough from the town, was enormous too. Irene had lived here her whole life, and she had never entirely decided how she felt about it, whether she found it beautiful or bleak or both simultaneously, which seemed most honest. She walked for what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 40 minutes. The road had dwindled to a track, and the track had dwindled to almost nothing. Her feet ached inside her good shoes, and the petticoats were heavy with dust, and the morning was warming fast the way Texas mornings did in April, going from cool to punishing in the space of 2 hours. She had no water and no food and no real idea where she was going. What she found, eventually, was a barn. It sat at the end of a rutted lane that branched off from the nearly vanished track, and it was a good solid barn, weathered cedar planks gone silver with age, a tin roof that had been patched in several places with newer metal that caught the light, a wide double door that was standing slightly ajar. Behind the barn she could see the corner of a house, modest and square, and beyond that, pasture where several horses stood in the early light, tails switching at flies that were already active despite the hour. Irene stood at the end of that rutted lane and looked at the barn, and made a decision that she recognized even in the moment as being somewhat desperate. But desperate was where she was, and the barn was there, and she could not keep walking in her good shoes in a wedding dress under a sky that was already beginning to burn. She went to the barn. The wide doors creaked as she pushed through them, and the interior smell hit her all at once, hay and horses and wood, and the particular animal warmth that barns hold even after the animals have been let out for the morning, which these had been. The stalls were empty, though she could see fresh water in the trough and clean hay bedded down in 2 of the stalls, which told her the horses were well cared for. Light came in through gaps between the cedar planks in long golden bars, and dust motes turned in the light, and it was, improbably, beautiful. She found a pile of clean hay in the corner of the largest stall, and she sat down on it, pulling her knees to her chest and pressing her back against the cedar wall, and she breathed. She had just walked away from her wedding. Douglas Pratt was going to be furious. Her father was going to be furious. The whole of Redemption Creek was going to have opinions about this for the next 6 months, because small towns in West Texas in 1883 ran on propriety and gossip in roughly equal parts, and a bride fleeing her own wedding was the kind of event that got talked about for generations. She would be a cautionary tale. She would be a scandal. She would be whispered about over church suppers and discussed in the dry goods store, and used as an example of what happened when girls got ideas above their station. She also would not be married to Douglas Pratt. She pressed her face against her knees and breathed, and after a while she realized she was crying, quietly, the way she had always cried, tucked in on herself, making as little noise as possible because her father's house had not been a place where crying was received well. She let herself do it. She had earned it. She had, just now, done the single most frightening thing she had ever done in her 24 years of careful, obedient living, and she was going to allow herself this much at least. She was still crying softly when she heard footsteps outside the barn. She pressed back against the wall and held very still, listening. The footsteps were measured and unhurried, the footsteps of someone who belonged here and was not in a hurry, moving across packed earth from the direction of the house. She heard the barn door open wider. She heard the footsteps come inside. She heard them stop. Irene held her breath. Gideon Lockhart stood at the entrance to the large stall and looked at the woman sitting in his hay, and he did not say anything for a long moment. He was 30 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that was always a day or 2 beyond shaving, and he wore work clothes, heavy canvas trousers, a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, suspenders, boots that were worn at the toe. He had a mug of coffee in each hand. This was because he had seen, from his kitchen window, a figure in white coming down his lane, and he had thought, with the particular pragmatism of a man who had lived alone for several years, that whoever it was probably needed coffee more than explanation. He had made 2 cups before he went to the barn. He had been wrong about a great many things in his life, but he was not wrong about the coffee. He looked at the woman in the hay. She was wearing a wedding dress. It was very dusty at the hem. Her eyes were red and her face was tear-stained, and she had both arms wrapped around her knees, and she was looking up at him with an expression that was equal parts defiance and mortification, like someone who had made an unconventional decision and was prepared to defend it but hoped, very much, that defense would not be necessary. He held out one of the mugs. She stared at it. He did not say anything. He just held it out, patient and steady, and waited. Irene looked at the mug for a moment longer, then she reached up and took it. Her hand was shaking slightly. The coffee was hot and strong. The Way Ranch coffee was made in a tin pot over a wood stove and capable of standing up on its own in cold weather. She wrapped both hands around the mug and felt the warmth spread through her palms and up her arms, and something in her chest that had been wound very tight began, very slightly, to loosen. Gideon lowered himself to sit on the edge of the stall partition, not close enough to crowd her, and he drank his own coffee and looked at the middle distance. The morning light came in through the barn walls in those golden bars, and the dust motes turned and turned. He did not ask a single question. He did not ask her name, or where she had come from, or why she was in his barn in a wedding dress, or what she intended to do next. He simply drank his coffee alongside her and let the silence be what it was, not awkward, not demanding, just present. A companionable silence, the kind that said you are here and that is all that is required of you right now. Irene drank her coffee and looked at the shaft of morning light falling across the hay, and she thought that she could not remember the last time a man had given her something without immediately attaching conditions to it. She drank the whole cup. After a while, the man set his empty mug down on the partition beside him and stood up. "There's water in the trough by the door if you need to wash your face," he said. His voice was quiet, unhurried, with the particular soft texture that West Texas put into voices after enough years. "Outhouse is behind the house to the left. I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything." He picked up his mug, picked up her empty mug, and walked out of the barn. Irene sat in the hay for another minute, listening to his footsteps recede. Then she stood up, shook the hay from her skirts, and went to wash her face. His name, she learned over the next hour, was Gideon Lockhart. She learned this not because he introduced himself, but because she found it burned into a wooden plaque on the gate post at the entrance to the Lane Lockhart Ranch, ESD, 1878. She also learned, from a brief survey of the property conducted while she worked up the courage to go to the house and explain herself, that he ran cattle on about 300 acres, that he kept 4 horses and 2 dogs, that his fence lines were good and his outbuildings were well maintained, and that his kitchen garden behind the house was newly planted with the kind of optimistic early April hopefulness that implied a person who paid attention to seasons. She went to the kitchen door and knocked. "Come in," he called. The kitchen was small and clean. There was a wood stove against one wall, an oilcloth-covered table in the center, 3 chairs of which one was clearly used more than the others. A shelf held cans and dry goods arranged with more care than strictly necessary. A rifle hung on pegs by the back door. There was a window over the dry sink that looked out over the kitchen garden, and on the windowsill, inexplicably, a small glass jar held 3 wildflowers that he must have picked recently, because they were still fresh. Gideon was at the stove, and he turned when she came in, and she looked at him properly for the first time. The dark eyes, the steadiness in them, the quality of someone who had been through some particular difficulty and had come out the other side not harder but somehow more careful. "I'm Irene Abbott," she said. "I apologize for being in your barn." "Gideon Lockhart," he said. "No apology needed." She stopped. She had prepared a reasonable, dignified explanation on her way from the barn to the kitchen door, and now that she was standing in front of him with his calm, dark eyes on her, it deserted her entirely. "I was supposed to get married this morning," she said instead, which was not the reasonable, dignified explanation but was at least the truth. "I see," he said. "I didn't," she said, "get married, I left. I walked away from the church and I walked north and I found your barn and I went inside because I didn't know what else to do." "All right," he said. She waited for him to say something more, to ask why, to offer an opinion, to point out the various ways in which her situation was problematic, the ways in which her reputation was now comprehensively ruined, the ways in which a woman alone and disgraced in West Texas in 1883 had very few options available to her. He did not say any of those things. He turned back to the stove and moved the coffee pot off the hottest burner and set it somewhere it would stay warm without burning. "I made cornbread," he said. "If you're hungry." She realized. Profoundly, suddenly hungry, with the hollow urgency of someone who had not eaten since the night before because she had been too anxious about the coming day to eat this morning. "Yes," she said. "Please." He set a plate on the table and pulled out a chair, not making a production of it, just making it available. She sat down. The cornbread was good, dense and slightly sweet, made with real butter, the kind of thing that a person made carefully rather than out of habit. There was a small pitcher of molasses and she used it. He sat across from her with his coffee and did not appear to require conversation. "I know how this looks," she said eventually. "How does it look? Like I've done something unforgivable, run from my obligations, humiliated a good man." She paused. "Although he isn't a good man. Douglas Pratt is not a good man, he's a prosperous one, and in this part of Texas those two things are frequently confused." Something shifted in Gideon's expression, not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it. "What did he do?" "Nothing specific," she said. "That's the trouble, he hasn't done anything specific. He wants to own things. He owns the dry goods store and he owns the feed lot and he owns a significant portion of my father's debt, and I believe he wanted to add my father's daughter to the collection." She looked at her plate. "I am 24 years old, Mr. Lockhart. I have been careful and quiet and obedient my entire life, and I have never once done a single thing for myself alone. I decided this morning that this particular thing, being given to a man like a piece of collateral, was a thing I would not do." She looked up at him. He was listening to her with the complete and genuine attention of someone for whom listening was not a performance. "So I ran," she said. "All right," he said. "That's all you have to say." "I have more to say," he said. "But most of it's your business, not mine. The part that is my business is this: you can stay here until you figure out what comes next. You're welcome to the barn, or there's a room off the kitchen that I use for storage, but it has a cot in it. Nobody in town comes out this way regular enough to cause you immediate trouble." Irene stared at him. "You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "I could be. Or a woman in a wedding dress sitting in my kitchen eating cornbread," he said quietly. "You're not a threat to me." "That's not what I meant," she said. "I meant, why would you help me? You don't know my character. You don't know if I'm honest or trustworthy, or you told me the truth about why you ran," he said. "Most people would have dressed it up more, made the man sound worse or themselves sound better. You were pretty straight about it." He picked up his coffee. "That's a reasonable sample of character." Irene looked at him for a long moment. The morning had gone fully warm now, and somewhere outside one of his dogs was barking at something distant and then stopping. She could hear his horses in the pasture, the occasional soft sound of them moving. The kitchen smelled like cornbread and coffee and wood smoke. "I'll take the room," she said. "Thank you." She slept for 3 hours that morning, which surprised her. She had thought she would lie awake on the narrow cot in the storage room, which was indeed full of crates and coils of rope and spare harness parts, and smelled pleasantly of leather and cedar. But she was apparently more exhausted than she had known, the way people sometimes are when they've been running on fear, and now the fear has crested and receded. She woke to the sound of hammering from somewhere outside, steady and purposeful, and she lay still for a moment listening to it. The room had one small window that looked north, away from the town. She could see scrubland and sky, and in the far distance a line of low hills that turned purple in the afternoon light. She could not see Redemption Creek from here. She found this deeply satisfying. She found the outhouse. She found a small mirror hung in the storage room and spent several minutes assessing the state of herself. The wedding dress was going to need serious attention. There was a long smear of dust from the hem up the front skirt panel, and her hair had come mostly down from the careful arrangement she had pinned it into at 6 o'clock this morning. She rebuilt the arrangement as best she could with the pins she had left, because her mother had always said that a woman could survive a great deal if she maintained the habit of tidiness. And while Irene suspected this was somewhat optimistic as a principle, it was a habit she had. Gideon was repairing a section of fence along the south pasture when she came out of the house. She walked out to where he was working and he glanced at her and went back to the fence, and she stood and watched him for a moment. He worked the way people who have been working with their hands for a long time work, efficiently, without wasted motion, paying attention to what he was doing. "I ought to help," she said, "with something. I can't simply inhabit your property and eat your cornbread. Can you cook?" He asked. "Yes," she said, "reasonably well. There's salt pork and beans soaking in the kitchen," he said. "If you can put them on by midday, they'll be ready by supper." It was such a simple and practical solution to a complicated situation that she almost laughed. "All right," she said. She went back to the kitchen and found the beans and the salt pork and put them in the big pot with the onion she found in the root cellar below the kitchen floor and the dried herbs on the shelf above the stove, and she set them to cook low and slow. And then she cleaned the kitchen because it was clear that Gideon was a man who kept things tidy but had no gift for thoroughness. And thoroughness was one of the things Irene Abbott was genuinely good at. She thought, while she cleaned, about what came next. This was a question that had no obvious answer. She could not go back to her father's house. Not yet, possibly not for a long time, because Gerald Abbott was going to have feelings about this morning that would take time to resolve, and she was not in a state to manage his feelings at the expense of her own. She could not go to Douglas Pratt, obviously. She had no money of her own, because women in her position rarely did, the entire structure of her world having been built on the assumption that she would pass from her father's care to her husband's care, without requiring resources of her own in between. She had a good education. Her mother, who had died 7 years ago, had believed in education and had made sure Irene had one, which meant she could read and write well and do arithmetic, and had a broader knowledge of history and literature than most women of her acquaintance in Redemption Creek. She could cook and sew and keep house. She could ride a horse reasonably well, though she hadn't had occasion to in several years. She had, as of this morning, a reputation in Redemption Creek that was going to precede her everywhere she went for the foreseeable future. What she did not have was any particularly clear plan. She set the beans to cook and stood at the kitchen window looking at the small garden, at the wildflowers on the windowsill. A man who picked wildflowers for his kitchen window was a different kind of man than Douglas Pratt, and this thought lodged somewhere in her chest with unexpected warmth, and she recognized it and set it aside as impractical. She was still thinking when Gideon came in at midday for water, and she had, without particularly intending to, made biscuits to go with the beans, and she had found where he kept his dried apple slices and made a simple apple pudding that would be ready by evening. He looked at the biscuits on the table and looked at her, and she felt unexpectedly the faint warmth of being seen. "You don't have to repay me," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He sat down and ate the biscuits and drank his water, and she sat across from him and drank a cup of the coffee that had been keeping warm all morning, and the silence between them was comfortable again, easy in the way that seemed to come naturally when he was in a room. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Do you live here entirely alone?" "Mostly," he said. "I have a ranch hand who comes out 3 days a week, fellow named Bert Caldwell, good man, drives a mule over from the Caldwell place about 4 miles east. He'll be here day after tomorrow." Will my being here cause difficulty? Gideon considered this. Bert's not a gossip, he said. He minds his own business considerable. He paused. But I'll tell him the situation straight and let him decide for himself whether to mention it anywhere. He's an honest man. I'd rather deal with him honest. I appreciate that, she said. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. What do you want? Not what you're going to do. I know that's complicated. But what do you want, if the wanting isn't constrained by anything practical? The question was so unexpected that she sat with it for a moment, turning it over. What did she want? Nobody had asked her that before. Not her father, not Douglas Pratt, not any of the various well-meaning women of Redemption Creek who had offered opinions about her situation. I want to stay somewhere that doesn't require me to be smaller than I am, she said finally. I want to use the things I'm capable of. I want to be somewhere where, she stopped. She had been about to say something more, something that surprised even her, and she was not ready to say it yet. I want room to breathe, she said instead. That's probably not a practical answer. It's a true one, he said, and there was something in his voice that was quiet and careful, like a man who understood very specifically what that kind of wanting felt like. She looked at him. How long have you been out here alone? She asked. 5 years, he said, give or take. She waited to see if he would say more. He did not, but the way he said it, give or take, suggested that the exactness of the years was something he had thought about more than once, counted and recounted. She did not push it. That evening they ate the beans and the apple pudding at the table, and outside the sky went through its nightly extravagance of color. The West Texas sunsets were one of the genuine miracles of the landscape, the kind of thing that made you understand why people stayed in spite of everything else. She washed the dishes and he dried them, which was not how she had expected the evening to go, and they talked, really talked, the way she hadn't talked to anyone in years. About books they had read, because he had a small shelf of them by his bed that she had noticed through the open bedroom door, and she was curious about it. About the history of the land, which he knew in the way of someone who had thought carefully about where he was living and what it meant. He knew that the Comanche had called this territory home for generations before the buffalo were decimated, and the wars ground down to a bitter finish. And he spoke about that with a directness that was not common in Redemption Creek, where the preferred approach to the subject was to not discuss it. Most folks in town don't like to think too hard about what it took to build out here, she said. I know, he said. Doesn't make it less true. No, she agreed. It doesn't. She went to bed in the storage room and lay on the cot and listened to the enormous West Texas night. The coyotes singing at the moon, the wind through the scrub, the settling sounds of the house, which was a good, well-built house that had been put up by someone who knew how to build and had expected to be here for a long time. She thought about Gideon Lockhart sitting across the table from her with his quiet eyes and his straight talk, and the fact that he had picked wildflowers for his kitchen window, and she thought that, whatever came next, she was glad she had run north and not south. 3 days passed, then 4. Irene borrowed a house dress that had belonged to, she did not ask whose, and it was a little large on her but wearable, and she hung the wedding dress carefully in the storage room, not ready to think about it yet. She cooked meals. She weeded the kitchen garden because it needed it badly. She helped Gideon mend a bridle that had cracked, sitting at the kitchen table with the harness leather and the proper needle and thread while he sat across from her with the other pieces. And their hands sometimes came close to each other reaching for the same tool. And she was aware of this in a way that she noted carefully and filed under things she was not going to examine too closely. Bert Caldwell came on the second day, a wiry man of about 50 with a face like a worn saddle and bright small eyes that missed nothing. Gideon spoke to him privately by the barn before bringing him in for the midday meal, and Bert Caldwell sat across the table from Irene and ate the stew she had made and looked at her with those bright eyes and said, Lockhart says you're resting here a spell while you work out your arrangements. That's correct, she said. Good stew, he said, and that appeared to be the end of it as far as Bert Caldwell was concerned. She liked him immediately. On the 5th day, trouble arrived. She was in the kitchen when she heard horses on the lane, and she looked out the window and felt her stomach drop because one of the riders was Douglas Pratt and the other was her father, and the third was the town sheriff, a broad, self-important man named Hale who wore his badge like it was doing him a personal favor. She stepped back from the window and thought very fast. Gideon was in the south pasture. She had no way to warn him quickly. The riders pulled up in front of the house and Pratt called out, "Lockhart! Lockhart, come out!" She heard Gideon's voice from somewhere behind the house. He must have come in through the back and his boots on the porch and then his voice at the front. "Can I help you?" Not a question, a statement. "We're looking for a woman," the sheriff said. "Lot of men are," Gideon said pleasantly. "Irene Abbott," Pratt said, and his voice had the quality of a man who was holding something very tightly. "She's on your property. We have reason to believe." "What reason?" "She was seen coming up your road by a drover who works the North Range," Pratt said, "5 days ago." "I see," Gideon said. "Is she here?" There was a pause. Irene pressed herself against the wall beside the kitchen window, listening. Her heart was beating very fast. "I'd be interested to know," Gideon said, "on what grounds you're coming onto my property and making demands. The sheriff, I understand that's his job, but Douglas Pratt, what claim do you have here?" "She's my intended," Pratt said. "She's your former intended," Gideon said. "From what I understand, she made her position clear 5 days ago. She wasn't in her right mind. She needs to come home. Does her father want her home, or does her creditor want his collateral back?" Gideon said. The pleasantness was still in his voice, but there was something else underneath it now, something that had edges. "Because those are 2 different situations, and only one of them is any of your business." Gerald Abbott spoke for the first time, and his voice had the sound of a man who had been rehearsing a dignity he wasn't sure he possessed. "Irene is my daughter. She belongs at home." "I expect that's for her to say," Gideon said. "Lockhart," the sheriff said, "I'd appreciate it if you just tell me whether she's here, because otherwise I'm going to need to look around your property, and I'd rather not do it that way." Another pause. Then Gideon said, "Give me a moment." She heard his boots on the porch and then on the kitchen floor, and he came through the kitchen door and looked at her standing against the wall. He closed the door quietly behind him. "You heard," he said. "Yes," she said. "You don't have to go out there," he said. "The sheriff has no legal ground to compel you. You haven't committed a crime. Leaving a wedding is embarrassing, not illegal." "I know," she said. "But you may want to," he said. "Talk to your father at least. Some things are better dealt with directly." He said this not as a directive but as an observation, placing it before her for her to consider. She thought about it. She thought about Gerald Abbott's face in the vestibule of the church 5 days ago, the complex mixture of pressure and something she had long refused to identify as regret. She thought about the fact that she was 24 years old and she had been hiding in a storage room for 5 days, and that while this had been, truthfully, some of the better days of her recent memory, it was not a permanent solution. "Will you come out with me?" she said. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. She straightened her borrowed house dress and walked out through the front door of Gideon Lockhart's house. Douglas Pratt looked at her from his horse, and his face went through a sequence of emotions: relief, anger, something proprietary and acquisitive in the space of a second. Her father looked at her, and his face did something more complicated that she did not have time to parse. "Irene," Pratt said, "you're coming back to town." "I'm not," she said. "Your father's debt is my father's debt," she said clearly. "Not mine. I have never been party to any financial agreement, Mr. Pratt. My father owes you money. That is a matter between you and my father. It is not a matter that requires me to marry you." Pratt's eyes went to Gideon, who was standing just behind Irene and slightly to her left, and she was aware of his presence there the way you were aware of a solid thing when you needed something to lean against. "Is that what he's been telling you?" Pratt said. "You've been out here for 5 days alone, with a decent man who has asked me no inappropriate questions and offered me hospitality," she said. "Yes. Your reputation is already settled by the fact that I walked out of that church," she said. You and I both know that, Mr. Pratt. I walked out of that church in front of the whole town, and it cannot be undone. My reputation in Redemption Creek is exactly what it is. I find I can live with that. The sheriff was looking uncomfortable, the way lawmen did when a situation turned out to be about feelings rather than the kind of thing a badge could solve. He looked at Gerald Abbott, who was looking at his daughter with an expression that was doing something interesting. Irene recognized with a jolt that her father was not entirely angry. He was something else, something that might, if she gave it enough room, become something adjacent to understanding. "Papa," she said, and her voice softened fractionally, "I could not do it. You know I could not do it." Gerald Abbott looked at his hat brim for a moment. He looked up, his face was more tired than angry. "What are you going to do, Irene?" he said. "You can't stay out here indefinitely." "I'm going to figure out what comes next," she said, "and when I've done that I'll come and tell you." The silence stretched. Then her father, with the small, heavy sound of a man releasing something he'd been holding for too long, said, "All right." "Abbott," Pratt said sharply. "Douglas," her father said, and his voice had shifted into something more resolute. The girl said no. "She said it in front of the church, and she's saying it now. I should have—" He stopped. He readjusted. "I'll sort out the debt another way." Pratt looked at Irene for a long moment, and she met his gaze without flinching, and eventually he turned his horse and rode back down the lane without another word. The sheriff touched his hat brim at Gideon, who nodded back and followed. Gerald Abbott lingered. "Your mother's dress is in there, I expect," he said. "It is," she said. "I'll take good care of it." He nodded once. Then he looked at Gideon Lockhart with the assessing look of a man who was recalibrating. Gideon met it steadily. Gerald Abbott turned his horse and rode after the others. Irene stood on the porch and watched them go until the dust settled back on the lane, and then she let out a long, slow breath. "Your father's not a bad man," Gideon said from behind her. "No," she agreed. "He's not. He's a weak one, which is in some ways worse, but not bad." She turned around. "Thank you for coming out with me." "You didn't need me," he said. "No," she said, "but I wanted you there." The quiet between them had a different quality now. She felt it. She thought, from the way he looked at her direct and then deliberately away, that he felt it too. She stayed. She wrote a letter to her father the following week, practical and measured, and sent it by way of Bert Caldwell, who had a daughter in town and made a trip in on Saturdays. The letter said that she was well and that she was working out her arrangements and that she had no desire for ongoing conflict. She received a letter back 3 days later, her father's handwriting, careful and slightly formal, which said that the debt to Douglas Pratt had been restructured through the sale of their 2 spare lots on the east side of town, and that Irene was not to worry about it. That Douglas Pratt had departed Redemption Creek for Fort Worth on business and was not expected back in the near future. That her room was available whenever she wished to use it. She read the letter at the kitchen table and felt something settle, some long-held tension go quiet. Good news. Gideon said. He was at the stove, doing something with the cast iron skillet that smelled like bacon. Manageable news, she said. Which is the best kind? June came. The Texas heat arrived with its full authority, the kind of heat that pressed down on everything from about 10 in the morning until an hour past sundown, and you learned to work early and late and rest in the burning middle hours. Irene had established a routine that fit itself around Gideon's without either of them quite discussing it. She rose early and made breakfast, worked the kitchen garden in the cool of the morning, cooked the midday meal, spent the hot hours in the relatively cool of the house sewing or reading from his shelf of books, and then came back out in the late afternoon when the temperature had relented marginally. She had sent for some of her things from her father's house, and she had established herself in the storage room with considerably more comfort than the first night, a proper pillow, her own hairbrush, 2 of her everyday dresses, her mother's small Bible. Gideon gave her a mare. Not formally. He didn't present it as a gift with ceremony. He simply, one morning, said that the gray mare in the second stall was getting too little exercise because he didn't have time to ride her with everything else that needed doing, and would Irene be willing to take her out for an hour in the mornings? Irene, who understood very clearly what was happening but chose to accept the framing, said that she supposed she could manage that. The mare's name was Pearl, and she was smooth-gaited and had a good temperament and liked apple slices, and riding her in the early mornings across the flat ranch land, while the sky turned from gray to pink to gold, was one of the better things that had happened to Irene in years. She started to teach herself the fence work, watching Gideon and then quietly doing portions of it herself when he didn't appear to be paying attention, and then doing it openly when he noticed and didn't say anything discouraging about it. She learned to drive the wagon into the nearest supply depot, a small establishment called Carver's Trading Post about 7 miles south, which was not Redemption Creek, but was on the road to it and served the ranches between town and the southern hills. She conducted the household accounts with a precision that Gideon clearly found both impressive and slightly embarrassing, because he had been keeping his accounts in the back of an old almanac in a manner that could charitably be described as approximate. "You were spending significantly more on flour than necessary," she told him one evening, spreading the almanac and the receipts from Carver's on the kitchen table. "If you buy in larger quantity at the mill on the South Road, you save nearly a third." He looked at the figures. "You're right," he said. "I usually am about numbers," she said, not with arrogance but with the simple accuracy of someone who had always been good at a thing. He smiled. She had been watching in the weeks since she had arrived for that smile, because it was infrequent enough to be notable and genuine enough to be remarkable. It started in his eyes, which went from their usual careful steadiness to something warmer and a little younger, and it moved to the corner of his mouth with the quality of something he was not quite keeping up with. "I'm beginning to think," he said, "that Douglas Pratt had no idea what he was planning to marry." "He knew exactly what he was planning," she said. "He just had the categories wrong. He thought he was acquiring a decorative and compliant housewife. He did not consider the possibility of an actual person." "His loss," Gideon said, and there was something in his voice when he said it that was more than just the observation, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. But it was there in the kitchen between them, warm and growing, the way things grow in April earth. There was an evening in late June, a Thursday. She remembered it specifically because Bert Caldwell had been by that day, and had brought with him a newspaper from Abilene, 3 weeks old but containing a remarkably detailed article about the proposed expansion of the railroad, which they had all discussed over the midday meal with considerable interest. The evening after that, she was sitting on the front porch in the last of the light, and Gideon came and sat on the step below her with his coffee, and the sky was doing the thing it did out here, the performance of color that went on until it was quite dark, and neither of them spoke for a long time. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Before I came out here, before 1878, I had a wife." He said it the way you said things that you had decided to say and were not going to back away from. "Her name was Clara. She died in 77, influenza. It was fast." Irene was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it with the full weight of it. "We'd been married 2 years," he said. She was a good woman. I built this place for her, more or less. We'd had the land and we were planning to come out together in the spring. She died in February." He looked at the darkening horizon. "I came out anyway. Seemed like the thing to do was to keep going, even if the going had changed what it was." "That makes sense," she said softly. "I'm not," he stopped, reconsidered. "I'm not telling you that because I want your sympathy. I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know who you've been sharing a kitchen table with for 2 months. She looked at the back of his head, the dark hair curling slightly at the collar, the set of his shoulders. "I'm glad you told me," she said. "Are you," she felt her way through the words carefully, "are you all right, or is all right not the right word?" "All right is the right word," he said. "I've had 5 years with it. I don't carry it the same way anymore." He was quiet for a moment. "It changed me, made me quieter, I think. Less interested in," he seemed to search for the word, "less interested in noise, more interested in things that are actually real. She understood this more than she could express easily, the way certain kinds of loss quieted you into the truth of things. "I think," she said carefully, "that you are one of the most genuinely real people I have encountered in my 24 years. He turned and looked at her. In the gathering dusk his eyes were very dark and entirely serious. "Irene," he said. "Yes," she said. "I find that he stopped. Something moved across his face that was careful and also brave. "I find that I am glad you came down my lane," he said, "in the wedding dress, with the dust on it." "I find that I am glad I did," she said. The night rose up around them, warm and enormous, and the coyotes started in the distance, and somewhere one of the horses shifted in the pasture, and neither of them moved for a long time. July was the month that things between them became undeniable. It happened in stages, the way things that are real happen, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small ones. The morning she reached past him for the salt and her hand brushed his, and neither of them moved away. The afternoon he rode out to the south fence and came back with his shirt soaked through with effort and a cut on his hand from the wire, and she cleaned the cut at the kitchen table, and their heads were bent close together, and neither spoke. The evening he read aloud from the Dickens novel on his shelf, sitting in the chair by the window while she sewed, and his voice in the quiet of the house felt like something essential and necessary. The day she came in from a hard ride on Pearl and laughed in the doorway from the effort and the beauty of it, and he looked up from the accounts she had shown him how to keep, and the expression on his face was something she carried with her for the rest of the day. She was sitting with the accounts one evening and he was working at the bench beside the door, repairing a leather stirrup, and the lamp was lit between them, and she said without looking up, "Gideon." "Yes," he said. "I believe I am in love with you," she said. She said it the way she had run from the church, quietly and steadily, and with the certainty of someone who had decided to stop being afraid of the true thing. "I think I have been for some time, and I have been trying to be sensible about it, but I find I'm not particularly interested in being sensible about this one thing." The sound of the stirrup repair stopped. She kept her eyes on the account ledger for a moment, and then she looked up. He was looking at her with an expression that was equal parts astonishment and recognition. The way you looked when someone said out loud the thing you had been thinking so carefully for so long that you had started to believe you were the only one thinking it. He set down the stirrup and the tool and he stood up and he came around the table and he stood in front of her, and she stood up too because it seemed right to be standing, to be fully present for this moment. "Irene," he said, and her name in his mouth had a quality she had never heard before in anyone else's, like something cared for and certain. "Yes," she said. "I have been." He took a breath. "I thought I would feel guilty. About," he didn't finish the sentence, but she understood it completely. "About feeling this again, about letting something grow in the place where grief had been." "I don't," he said. "I don't feel guilty. I feel," he looked at her, and the careful thing in his eyes had given way to something warmer and more direct. "I feel like a man who has been given something extraordinary and is very aware of not deserving it and is going to be as careful with it as he knows how to be." "You deserve it," she said, and she meant this with everything in her. "You are the most deserving person I know." He reached out and took her hand, both of his around one of hers, and it was the first time he had touched her with intention, and she felt it from her hand all the way through her, warmth and solidity, and something that was the opposite of all the feeling of being small and constrained that had built up over the last years of her life. "I love you," he said. "I have for some time. I didn't say it because I didn't want to complicate your situation. You came here because you needed somewhere safe, and I didn't want—" "Gideon," she said gently. "Yes. You are allowed to want things," she said. "You're allowed to say them." He looked at her for a moment, and then, with the quiet deliberateness that characterized everything he did, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, and they stood like that in the lamplight with the vast Texas night outside and his hands around her hand. "Will you stay?" he said. "Not because you have nowhere else to go, because I know you could go plenty of places. You could go back to your father, you could go east. You could find work, you're more than capable of it. I mean, will you stay here?" "With me, yes," she said. "I will stay here with you." He kissed her then, and it was like everything else about him, unhurried and genuine and full of something that paid attention. August brought a dry spell that had Gideon worried about the water situation in the south pasture, and Irene, who had been quietly thinking about this since she had first walked those fence lines in June, proposed a solution involving the creek that ran along the north edge of the property, which was still running though slowly, and a system of trenching that she had read about in one of his almanacs and which seemed applicable. They worked on it together for 3 days, in the early mornings and the late afternoons, digging the trench and laying the wooden flume, and by the end of it they had water moving into the south pasture trough, and they were both filthy and exhausted and deeply satisfied. "Where did you read about trench irrigation?" he said, sitting on the fence rail at the end of the 3rd day, both of them looking at the slow trickle of water moving down the flume. "The 1879 almanac," she said. "The one with the broken spine on the second shelf. I've had that almanac for 4 years," he said. "I never read that section." "You read the weather predictions obsessively," she said. "And the livestock tables." "The livestock tables are useful. So is the irrigation section," she said, "as it turns out." He laughed, and it was one of those full ones, the ones that were rarer and therefore more valuable, and she thought that she was going to spend a great deal of her life trying to produce that sound because it was one of the better things in the world. He proposed to her in September, not with fanfare. It was a Sunday morning, and she had ridden Pearl out to the North Ridge, which was the highest point of the property, and offered a view in 3 directions. And she had found when she got there that he was already there on his big bay gelding, Ranger, having ridden out early. They had sat their horses side by side looking at the land, his land, which she had come to know, and which had come to feel like hers in the way that places do when you have worked them and walked them and watched every light they made. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. He was looking out at the horizon with the particular expression of someone choosing their words. "You came here in a wedding dress," he said, "and I understand if the whole subject of marriage is a complicated one." "The subject of that marriage was complicated," she said. "The subject in general is not necessarily." He looked at her then. "Will you marry me, Irene?" She had been expecting it and not expecting it simultaneously, which was the way things were with him. You could see things coming with Gideon Lockhart and still be moved by them when they arrived. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you." He reached across from his saddle, and she reached from hers, and they held hands above the scrub and the dry grass with the September sky enormous and blue above them, and it was nothing like the vestibule of the First Methodist Church with the organ droning and the smell of candle wax. It was better. It was so much better. They were married in October in the town of Carver's Crossing, which was the next town over from Redemption Creek, and had a circuit judge who came through once a month and who performed civil marriages with the brisk efficiency of a man with a lot of ground to cover. It was a Wednesday. Bert Caldwell and his daughter Macy stood as witnesses. Irene wore a blue calico dress she had made herself from fabric ordered from Abilene. She had decided, with the quiet resolution that had come to characterize her decisions, that her mother's ivory dress deserved to hang in a cedar chest and be kept for a different occasion, and that this one deserved its own color. Gideon wore his good coat and had actually cut his hair, which she noticed and said nothing about, but which made her feel, every time she looked at him across the small office where the judge conducted the ceremony, like something was very specifically and deliberately right about this moment. The judge asked the requisite words and they gave the requisite answers, and when he said, "husband and wife," Gideon looked at her with those dark eyes and the something warmer than careful that had been there since July, and he took her face in both his hands and kissed her in front of the judge and Bert Caldwell and Macy Caldwell with a thoroughness that made the judge clear his throat and Macy laugh outright. Bert Caldwell bought them dinner at the establishment in Carver's Crossing that served food, which was not quite a restaurant and not quite a saloon, but occupied the middle ground with its oilcloth tables and its decent beef stew, And they ate and talked and laughed, and it was, Irene thought, the finest wedding dinner she had ever attended, largely because it was the only one she had actually chosen to be at. She wrote to her father that evening. A long letter, more honest than most of their correspondence, telling him about the marriage and about the ranch and about Gideon, who she described with the careful accuracy she brought to all descriptions, his steadiness, his honesty, his gift for quiet, the wildflowers on the kitchen windowsill. She wrote that she hoped her father would come and visit when he was ready, and that she did not hold the events of April against him, and that she hoped he would not hold them against himself. Gerald Abbott came for Christmas. He arrived on the 23rd of December on a rented horse from Redemption Creek, having taken the supply road north, and he stood in the yard in front of the house with his hat in his hands and a covered basket over one arm that contained, as it turned out, a jar of Irene's grandmother's preserved plums, and a package of tobacco for Gideon that he had clearly purchased with the intention of making a good impression. Gideon shook his hand on the porch and said, "Good to have you, Mr. Abbott," and meant it, which was not the easiest or most automatic thing in the world, and Irene loved him for it. Her father looked at the ranch, the good fences, the strong house, the horses in the pasture, the kitchen garden now brown and turned for winter, and at his daughter who was standing in the doorway in her calico house dress with flour on her hands from the bread she was making, and his face did the complicated thing again, but this time the complication resolved into something clear. "You look well," he said to her. "I am well," she said. "Come in out of the cold, Papa." They spent 2 days together, and it was not without the occasional stiffness of people who had said and not said things to each other for too long, but Gideon navigated it with a naturalness that she could only attribute to genuine good while drawing her father out on the subject of the ranch, listening to his accounts of Redemption Creek, asking questions about Irene's childhood that Gerald Abbott, somewhat to his own surprise, appeared to find he enjoyed answering. On the second evening, her father sat at the kitchen table after dinner with a cup of coffee and looked at Gideon with the expression of a man making a final assessment. "You make her laugh," he said. "I could hear it from the barn this afternoon." "She makes me laugh," Gideon said, "considerably more than I make her in the balance." Gerald Abbott nodded slowly. "I was wrong," he said, "about Pratt, about the debt, about all of it. I want to say that plainly." "I know you were," Irene said, not unkindly. "I know." "I'm sorry," her father said, and it came out of him like something that had been held in a place that wasn't meant for holding, and she went around the table and put her hand on his shoulder, and he put his hand over hers, and they sat like that for a moment. "It's all right, Papa," she said. "It really is." He left on the morning of Christmas Day, refusing to intrude on their holiday, and shook Gideon's hand again at the gate and hugged Irene in the way of men of his generation who had not had a lot of practice at it but were making the effort. And then he rode south back toward Redemption Creek, and Irene stood at the gate and watched him go with something settled and whole in her chest. She turned to find Gideon standing behind her. "Good man," he said. "Getting there," she said. He put his arm around her, and they went inside. Winter on the ranch was its own particular character, the cold that came down from the north in January with serious intentions, the way the landscape went a different color, the gray-brown of scrub without the green that a wet summer could coax out of it, the frozen mud and the ice in the water troughs that needed to be broken every morning. They worked through it together, the daily rhythms of keeping the animals alive and warm and fed, and the evenings were long and they used them well reading, talking, playing the card games she had taught him, and he had rapidly become better at than her, which she found simultaneously irritating and endearing. She discovered that she was expecting their child in February, though she had suspected it since January. She told him at breakfast, matter-of-factly, because that was how she and Gideon Abbott Lockhart she had hyphenated internally, though she signed letters with Lockhart out of practical consideration, handled things of substance. She set down his coffee and said, "I think we're going to have a child." He looked up at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that was younger than his usual self, something unguarded and very bright. "Are you certain?" he said. "Reasonably," she said. "I'll know more in another month, but reasonably, yes." He stood up from the table and came around it and held her, not dramatically but carefully, with the particular care he brought to things that were important to him, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt his hands on her back, steady and warm. "Are you frightened?" he said. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Considerably," he said, "but in the good way." "Yes," she said, "in the good way." She wrote to her father. She wrote to Bert Caldwell, who had become in the months since October something genuinely resembling a family friend, the kind of person who showed up with practical gifts at practical moments and had an excellent instinct for when to stay and when to leave. She did not write to anyone else in Redemption Creek, though she suspected word would travel on its own, the way it did. Spring came again, the 2nd April on the Lockhart ranch, and very different from the first. The kitchen garden was planted early with the experience of last year's knowledge behind it. The irrigation flume had been extended over the winter and was working better than ever. Pearl had been bred with a neighboring rancher's stallion and was coming into her pregnancy with the placid confidence of a horse who had done this before. 2 new calves had arrived in March, healthy and loud, and indignant about the whole experience. The ranch was expanding in the quiet way of things that are well tended, not explosively, not because of luck, but because 2 people who were paying attention to it were making it grow. Irene had taken on the bookkeeping entirely and had identified 3 areas of the operation where they could improve efficiency without increasing cost, and Gideon had implemented them with the trust of a man who understood when to follow someone else's lead. They had hired a second hand in addition to Bert, a young man of about 20 named Eli Torres, whose family had ranched these lands before the war and who knew cattle and horses with an authority that exceeded his years. Their son was born on the 1st of June, 1884. He arrived with the force of personality that Irene had somehow known he would have, loudly, and with considerable impatience, in the room off the kitchen that was no longer the storage room, but had been transformed over the winter into something considerably more suitable. The midwife from Carver's Crossing attended, a capable woman named Mrs. Howarth, who had delivered a significant portion of the population of 3 counties, and had the unflappable authority that came with that. Gideon had spent the hours of labor in the kitchen making coffee that nobody drank and repairing things that didn't need repairing and trying to stay useful. When Mrs. Howarth opened the door and said, "You have a son," he was on his feet before she finished the sentence. He was allowed in after a few minutes, and he came to where Irene was sitting propped against the pillows they had moved into the room, holding the baby in the calico quilt that her father had sent for Christmas, and she looked up at him and said, "Come and meet your son." Gideon sat on the edge of the cot and looked at the baby, who had dark hair and was regarding the world with the suspicious focused attention of someone who had just arrived somewhere and was still assessing the situation. "He looks like he has opinions," Gideon said softly. "He does," she said. "He started having them approximately 2 hours ago and has not stopped." He reached out and the baby's hand, tiny and furiously curled, found his finger and held on, and Gideon Lockhart, who was not a man given to public demonstrations, pressed the back of his free hand against his mouth for a moment and breathed. "Samuel," she said. "I thought Samuel, if you agree." "Samuel," he said. "Yes, Samuel Lockhart." "Samuel James Lockhart," she said. James had been his father's name, a detail he had told her one evening in November and which she had kept. He looked at her then, and there was something in his face that was full and clear and entirely without the careful guardedness that had been there when she had first found him standing at the stall entrance with 2 mugs of coffee, and a fundamental decency that she had recognized immediately, even then, even in her distress and fear. He looked at her the way a man looked when he had everything he wanted and knew it. "I love you," he said. "I'm always going to love you." "I know," she said. "I love you too." "Always." She slept then, with Samuel in the crook of her arm, and she could hear Gideon in the kitchen talking quietly to Mrs. Howarth, and then later she heard him come back and sit in the chair they had moved into the room, and she fell asleep to the sound of him there, present and real and hers. Her father came in the fall to meet Samuel and arrived bearing a carved wooden rattle that he had clearly made himself, imperfectly and with considerable effort, which was a better gift than anything he could have purchased, and she told him so. Gerald Abbott held his grandson with the self-consciousness of a man who had not held an infant in many years, and the helpless expression of someone who had not expected to feel this much about it. And Samuel regarded him with the focused assessment that was already becoming a defining characteristic, and then, apparently satisfied with his evaluation, fell asleep against his grandfather's shoulder. Gerald Abbott looked up at Irene over the sleeping baby and said nothing, but his eyes were bright, and she understood. Redemption Creek's opinion of her situation had, as she had expected, evolved over the year and a half since April 1883. The initial scandal had been substantial, and she had heard about it in fragments from various sources, the whispered conversations, the women who had discussed her choices over quilting circles and church socials, the particular tone that small towns used to process events that threatened the established order. She had let it run its course. She had not been in town to hear it directly, which helped. And time, in the way of time, had moved it to the rear of the collective memory, as newer and more interesting events provided fresher material. Douglas Pratt had not returned from Fort Worth, and then had been heard of in New Mexico territory, and then had not been heard of at all, which was how Redemption Creek processed the people who left it. A period of gossip followed by a period of decreased interest, followed by an almost geological forgetting. When Irene did go into Redemption Creek, which she did occasionally, for supplies that Carver's trading post did not carry, or to visit her father, who was doing well and had taken up an unlikely but evidently satisfying hobby of beekeeping, she went as Irene Lockhart of the Lockhart Ranch, with her husband beside her and a clear sense of herself that had no anxiety in it. The town had the good sense to receive her as such. A few of the women she had grown up with had done the work of becoming something like allies. Agnes Prewitt from the general store, who had always been sensible, had said directly on one of the first visits that she thought Irene had done the right thing and she wasn't the only one, and that Douglas Pratt had been no great loss to the community. Irene had thanked her and bought thread, and they had maintained a cheerful if not intimate acquaintance ever since. 2 years after that first April, in the spring of 1885, Irene was sitting on the front porch in the evening with Samuel, who was by now 11 months old and deeply interested in the concept of standing upright and deeply frustrated by his own limitations on that front, when Gideon came out from the barn where he had been with Eli addressing an issue with one of the new calves, and sat down beside her on the porch step. "Eli's got it sorted," he said. "The calf is fine." "Good," she said. Samuel had grabbed her finger with both hands and was attempting to use it as a means of achieving vertical, listing dangerously to the left. "He's going to walk soon," Gideon said, watching his son's engineering efforts. "He's going to walk tomorrow if I had to guess," she said. "He is not a patient child." "No," Gideon said, and there was warmth and amusement in it. "I wonder where he gets that from." She looked at him. "I am extremely patient." "You are extremely determined," he said. "Those aren't the same thing." She laughed. Samuel, apparently delighted by the sound, toppled sideways with a thump and looked at the porch boards with an expression of philosophical consideration, and then made a noise of generalized grievance. Gideon leaned down and picked him up, settling him against his shoulder, and Samuel immediately seized a fistful of his collar and craned his head to look at the horses in the pasture, which were his current primary interest in life. Gideon held him steady, and they all sat in the fading light, the three of them, and the sky did its reliable, magnificent thing. "I want to expand the cattle operation," Gideon said. "I've been looking at the land to the east, the Haverford place, Old man Haverford is looking to sell. He's going back to Missouri to be near his daughter. 300 acres would double our range. Do we have the capital? She said. Close, he said. The fall cattle drive brought in strong. If we put the proceeds against a note from the bank in Abilene, I think we can manage it. What's the interest rate? He told her, and she did the arithmetic in her head in the way she had always been able to, working the figures in the quick, silent machinery of her mind. We can manage it, she said, provided we have a good year. If we have a poor year, we'll be tight in the second year of the note. That's my assessment too, he said. Are you in favor? She liked this about him, that he asked, that the ranch was theirs and he treated it that way without ceremony or qualification. Yes, she said, I'm in favor. 300 acres is worth the risk. We should also talk to Eli about a third hand for the spring and summer. He mentioned a cousin, Gideon said. Let's hear about the cousin, she said. Samuel had fallen asleep on his father's shoulder, which happened with the sudden completeness of infant sleep, one moment fully engaged and the next entirely absent. Gideon shifted him gently and they both sat quietly in the last of the evening light. I have been thinking, Irene said after a while. About what? About the school, she said. She had been thinking about it for several months and had not quite finished the thought enough to say it out loud until now. The Carver's Crossing School has 16 students and one teacher who is responsible for 8 grade levels and is very clearly overwhelmed. I went to the school there with Samuel last month when I took him to see Mrs. Howarth for the regular visit, and the teacher, young woman, Miss Harlow, she looked exhausted. The upper students aren't getting the attention they need. She paused. I have a solid education. I know mathematics and history and literature, and I can write. I could help if the school board were willing. He was quiet for a moment, and she recognized this as him thinking seriously rather than hesitating. How far is Carver's Crossing? He said. 7 miles. Too far to go every day with Samuel. I know, she said. I was thinking 2 days a week. Take Samuel with me on Pearl. He can be in the schoolroom while I help Miss Harlow with the older students. He'd survive it. He'd probably love it, Gideon said. He loves being in the middle of things. He does, she agreed. His father's son in that regard. She smiled. Gideon looked at her with the expression that had stopped surprising her but never stopped meaning something. The one that said she was exactly what she was, and he knew it and was grateful for it with a depth that didn't require daily articulation. All right, he said. Let's go talk to the school board. She started at the Carver's Crossing School in September of 1885. She went twice a week, with Samuel in a basket slung on Pearl's side, and she took the upper 3 grade levels and Miss Harlow took the lower 5. And within a month the improvement in the upper students was marked enough that the school board, a small committee of 3 local ranchers and the preacher from the Baptist church, came to her and offered to pay her a proper wage for the work. She accepted. Samuel, age 1.5, did indeed love the schoolroom. He sat in his basket and later, as his confidence with standing and then walking developed, patrolled the edges of the room with the solemnity of a small inspector while the older children worked their lessons, and occasionally accepted treats from sympathetic students who were charmed by him. He was beginning to talk by December, deliberate, considered words, one at a time, delivered with the focused certainty of someone who said things because he meant them. His father's son in that too. Her father came for Christmas again, and this time he stayed a full week, and the house had a fullness to it that Irene measured and kept somewhere private and warm. Gerald Abbott had made his peace over the months with the truth of what had happened between them. He was not a man who found apologies easy, but he was a man who, when he accepted that he had been wrong, changed his behavior absolutely, which was its own kind of integrity. He talked to Samuel with a seriousness that the child clearly appreciated. He talked to Gideon about cattle and about the weather and about the county politics with the enjoyment of a man who had found an interlocutor worth having. On the last evening he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and looked around the room, the clean order of it, the books on the shelf, the wildflowers still in their jar on the windowsill even in December, dried now but still there, the sound of Samuel asleep in his room down the hall, and he said to no one in particular, "This is a good house." "It is," Irene agreed. "You did right," he said. "I want to say that. You did right walking out of that church." "I know, Papa," she said gently. "I know. I just want you to know that I know it," he said. "That's all." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his palm up and held it. The Haverford land came through in the spring of 1886. The purchase went smoothly. Old man Haverford was glad to deal with Gideon, who was straight in all his business, and paid what he agreed to pay when he agreed to pay it, which was not as common as it should have been. Eli's cousin turned out to be a man named Diego Torres, 23 years old and as capable with cattle as Eli had suggested, and he was hired on for the full season with the understanding that if things went well, there would be year-round work. The ranch was growing in the way that Irene had imagined it could, the way she had seen clearly from the beginning, because she had always been able to see the shape of things if given the room to look at them, without being told what to think. 600 acres now, with a cattle operation that was starting to have a real reputation in the county for good stock and honest dealing. The irrigation system had been extended twice. The kitchen garden had become a proper kitchen garden that produced enough that they were giving surplus to the Torres family who lived 4 miles east. In the fall of 1886, Samuel turned to and demonstrated his considerable vocabulary by conducting what appeared to be, to the great delight of Eli and Diego, a serious and detailed inspection of the new cattle, naming each one with a kind of absolute authority that suggested he had given the matter significant prior thought. Gideon stood at the fence with his arms on the top rail and watched his son work through the herd with an expression that Irene, standing beside him, would have needed several sentences to fully describe. She was expecting again by October. She told him in the same practical morning table manner as the first time, and his reaction was the same, the bright unguarded thing, the careful holding of her, the somewhat comical attempt to remain composed. She watched him try and fail and loved him very specifically for the failing. 2 children, he said against her hair. 2 years ago I was sitting in this kitchen alone. You had the wildflowers, she said. He laughed. I had the wildflowers, he said. And then you came down my lane in a wedding dress. And you brought coffee, she said, and asked no questions. The questions would have waited, he said. You needed the coffee. I did, she said. I very much did. Do you ever think about it, he said, how close it was if you'd walked south instead of north? I think about it sometimes, she said. But then I think that you had flowers in your window, which is not the behavior of a man who would go undiscovered for long. I would have found you eventually. I'd like to believe that, he said. Believe it, she said. It's true. Their daughter was born in May of 1887, with considerably more patience than her brother and considerably more volume, which suggested a relationship with paradox that Irene suspected would be a defining characteristic. They named her Clara Ruth Lockhart Clara for the woman Gideon had loved before, because Irene had suggested it with a gentleness that had made something in him go very quiet for a moment and then very settled, and Ruth for Irene's mother, who had given her a good education and a habit of tidiness, and the belief that women were capable of more than the space they were usually given. Clara Ruth Lockhart arrived in the world with opinions about everything, and enough energy to run through 4 changes of sleeping clothes in one day, and a look on her face from the very first hour that suggested she was taking notes. She and Samuel regarded each other in the first days with the cautious assessment of 2 people who have been informed they must share a territory and have not yet determined the terms. By July, they were inseparable. The school at Carver's Crossing grew. Miss Harlow married a local rancher in 1888 and left the school, and Irene, by this time well established with the students and the community, was asked to take on the full position of teacher, which she declined in the full sense but negotiated into a larger part-time arrangement that allowed her to maintain the ranch work that she was not willing to give up. She found a second part-time teacher, a young man fresh from a teaching college in San Antonio, and between them they managed the school adequately enough that enrollment increased the following year. Gideon rode in with her twice a week in the wagon now, with both children in the back, because Samuel had reached the age where he was furious about not being allowed to stay home and help with the cattle, and Gideon had decided that occasional mornings in the schoolroom were a reasonable compromise that would equip him better for the actual running of a ranch than any amount of fence line following could. Samuel sat in the back of the wagon with his arms folded and his jaw set, and Clara pressed against his side like a small determined comma, and Gideon drove and Irene sat beside him on the wagon bench, and their shoulders touched with the comfortable, easy contact of people who have been this close for long enough that it has become like breathing. "He's going to be a difficult student," Gideon said of Samuel on one such drive. "He's going to be an excellent student," she said. "He's going to hate admitting it, which is entirely different. He gets that from his mother," Gideon said. She looked at him. "I am never difficult." "You are the most delightfully, specifically difficult person I have ever known," he said, "and I mean that as the highest compliment." She looked at him for another moment and then laughed, and Clara, who at 17 months found her mother's laugh to be the best possible signal that all was right with the world, laughed too from the wagon bed, and Samuel, despite himself, smiled. In 1889, the Lockhart Ranch expanded again. Not in land this time, but in a second barn and a new stable, built properly this time with the help of a carpenter from Abilene who came down for 3 weeks and built them something that Gideon looked at when it was finished, with the satisfaction of a man seeing a thing done right. The new barn had 12 stalls and a full loft and a tack room that Irene immediately organized with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, and Gideon stood in the doorway of the tack room after she had finished and said, "I'm not going to be able to find anything in here." "You're going to be able to find everything in here," she said. "For the first time in your life. Before you, I found things by looking for them until I found them. That's not finding things, that's hoping," she said, and went back to her ledgers. The ledgers by this point told a satisfying story. The ranch was solid. Not wealthy in the way that the big cattle operations to the north were wealthy, not the kind of operation that bent county politics with its weight, but solid and self-sustaining and growing carefully in the direction they chose for it. Gideon had a reputation in the county as a man who sold good stock and paid his debts and dealt straight, which was the reputation that mattered in this part of Texas, and which built the kind of relationships that lasted. They went to Redemption Creek less often than they used to, but more comfortably when they did. The town was changing. The railroad spur had come within 12 miles, and there was talk of it coming closer, and the depot that had appeared 2 years ago at the new junction was already changing the flow of commerce in ways that touched even the ranches. Gerald Abbott had done well enough with the beekeeping that he was now supplying honey to 3 establishments in Redemption Creek, and had taken on a young man to help him with the hives, which Irene found quietly wonderful. Her father, who had spent most of her childhood under the shadow of his financial troubles, finding something small and sweet and genuinely productive. On a Sunday afternoon in October of 1889, Irene Lockhart sat on the front porch of the house that Gideon had built for a woman who had not been able to come to it, and which had become, in the 6.5 years since she had found his barn in her wedding dress, as thoroughly and genuinely hers as anything she had ever known. The afternoon had the October quality of the Texas plains, the heat gone from it, a clarity in the air that sharpened everything, the hills to the south a blue-purple in the particular light, the scrub along the fence lines throwing their small shadows long across the packed earth. Samuel, 5 years old, was in the pasture with his father, conducting what appeared to be an extremely serious conversation about one of the younger horses. Clara was asleep inside, having expended herself comprehensively during the morning and crashed into a nap with her characteristic lack of half measures. The 2 dogs were on the porch with Irene, one on each side, warm and heavy in content. The kitchen smelled of the apple cake she had put in the oven an hour ago, and would be done in another 30 minutes. She thought, sitting in that particular October light, about the morning she had stood at the back of the First Methodist Church and felt the enormous terrible thing rising in her chest. The vestibule, the organ, her father's face, the smell of candle wax, the door swinging shut behind her, the walking north, with no plan and no money and no idea what came next, the barn, the golden bars of light, the hay, the man in the work clothes and the suspenders standing at the entrance to the stall with 2 mugs of coffee, holding one out without a word, asking nothing, giving everything in that moment: safety, coffee, the simple revolutionary gift of a space where nothing was required of her except to breathe and be still. She thought about the long road from that morning to this one, the weeks in the barn and the kitchen, the confrontation on the porch, the slowly strengthening certainty of feeling, the evening she had said, "I believe I am in love with you," while he was repairing a stirrup, the judge in Carver's Crossing and the blue calico dress and Macy Caldwell laughing, Samuel arriving with his opinions intact, Clara arriving with her volume and her energy and the name that honored a woman who had come before and been loved, and whom Irene honored because Gideon had loved her, and because love, the real kind, was not diminished by being shared. The school, the irrigation flume, the expanded range, the new barn, the ledgers that told the story of something built carefully by 2 people who paid attention. Gideon came through the pasture gate with Samuel on his shoulders, and Samuel was talking with both hands, which he did when he was explaining something important. And Gideon's expression was the one she had been collecting for 6.5 years, the not quite smiling, fully listening, completely present look of a man who found what was in front of him to be exactly what he wanted to be looking at. He put Samuel down at the porch steps, and Samuel came up the steps at speed and reported, with great urgency, that the young horse was going to need a new name because the current name was wrong, and he had decided on something much better. And Irene asked what name he had decided on, and listened to his reasoning with the seriousness it deserved, and they discussed it for several minutes before reaching an agreement. Gideon leaned on the porch post and listened to all of this, and then, when Samuel had gone inside, came and sat beside her on the porch bench, his arm along the back of it, warm and solid. "Apple cake," he said. He could smell it. 20 more minutes, she said. He nodded. They sat in the October light. "Gideon," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want to tell you something." "Tell me." She looked at him, the dark eyes, the jaw, the way he was still, even now after all this time, the most essentially calm presence she had ever been near, the kind of calm that was not absence but fullness, the quiet of a thing that is completely itself. She thought about the morning she had come down his lane with no plan and everything to figure out, and how he had given her coffee and asked no questions, and how that single act of uncomplicated decency had been the foundation of everything that followed. "I am so glad it was your barn," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then the smile came, the full one, the rare good one, the one that moved from his eyes to his mouth with the unhurried quality of something genuine. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face with the ease of a man who had done this thousands of times and intended to do it thousands more. "So am I," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together on the porch of the ranch that was theirs, in the October afternoon of the West Texas plains, while the apple cake finished in the kitchen and Clara slept, and Samuel made decisive pronouncements somewhere inside about the horse's new name, and the hills to the south went deep purple in the changing light, and the dogs lay heavy and warm on either side of them, and the sky, as it always did out here, went on forever in every direction, enormous and clear and full of the kind of light that made everything look exactly like what it was. They sat there a long time. They had time, and they knew it, and they did not waste it. In the years that followed, and there were many of them, good ones, full and various people in and around Redemption Creek and Carver's Crossing sometimes told the story of Irene Abbott, who had walked away from her wedding in the spring of 1883 and gone north and ended up at the Lockhart Ranch, because it was the kind of story that people liked to tell. The versions varied in their details, as stories do. Some versions made Douglas Pratt worse than he was, some made Irene's father worse than he deserved. Some added drama that hadn't occurred, some simplified the truth into something neater than it had actually been. But the core of the story, the part that everyone told the same way, was this. She had come down the lane in a wedding dress, and he had brought her coffee and asked no questions, and that had been the beginning of everything. Irene, when she heard this version, always said that it was accurate as far as it went, but that the coffee had been very good, which she thought deserved mention. Gideon, when he heard it, said nothing in particular, but looked like a man who was in possession of more happiness than he had expected the world to offer him, and was treating that possession with appropriate care. Samuel Lockhart grew up to be a rancher. As had been clear from the first morning, he walked through the pasture gate on his own 2 feet toward the cattle with the focused authority of someone who knew exactly what he was going to do. He was serious and capable, and had his father's steadiness, and his mother's precision with numbers, which turned out to be an excellent combination for the running of a ranch. He married a woman from a ranch family in the next county who could outride him on a good day and knew it, which he found, as he put it, both irritating and wonderful, which suggested he had been paying attention to the right examples growing up. Clara Lockhart grew up to have opinions about absolutely everything, which was exactly as it appeared she would, and she used them to considerable effect. She taught school at Carver's Crossing for several years before moving to San Antonio, where she took up a position with a women's educational association that was doing the kind of work her grandmother, had she lived to see it, would have recognized and approved of. She wrote home every week without fail, long letters full of detail and humor, and the occasional polemic that made her father laugh and her mother nod. Gerald Abbott, who lived to a robust 78, spent the last years of his life as something of a fixture at the Lockhart Ranch, particularly in the summers, and could be found most mornings in the kitchen garden doing whatever needed doing with the comfortable authority of a man who has finally found his useful place in a situation. He and Gideon never became demonstratively close in the way that some men become, but they became the kind of close that is built from years of shared meals and shared work and shared interest in the same woman's happiness, which is a particular and durable kind. The ranch itself continued to grow and to be, through all the seasons and changes of that country, through the dry years and the wet ones, through the shift from open range to fenced land as the century turned, through the coming of the telephone line and the motor car, and all the other changes that arrived and rearranged the world, a good place, built by people who had been paying attention. The irrigation flume that Irene had devised from the 1879 almanac was extended 3 more times. The kitchen windowsill always had something in a jar: dried flowers in winter, fresh ones in every other season. The ledgers were kept with precision. The coffee was strong. And sometimes in the evenings, when the day's work was finished, and the house was settled and quiet, Irene and Gideon would sit on the porch, older now, the hair at his temples gone silver and the lines around her eyes deeper, and the quality of their silence even more complete and comfortable than it had been at the beginning, and watch the sky do what the Texas sky always did, the magnificent, indifferent performance of light that went on regardless of the human business below it. And sometimes one of them would say something and sometimes neither would, and it was exactly the same either way, because what had been built between them in the years since a dusty April morning in 1883 was the kind of thing that didn't require speech to be present, the kind of thing that was in the air between 2 people like warmth from a stove, steady and real, and not going anywhere. The barn was still there. Silver cedar planks, the tin roof that had been repaired and re-repaired over the decades, the wide double doors that still stood slightly ajar in the mornings. Sometimes Irene went out to it in the early light, not for any particular reason, but the way you returned to the places that mattered, the coffee-colored mornings of her memory, the golden bars of light through the cedar planks, the particular smell of hay and horses and wood. She would stand in the entrance to the large stall and look at it, and she would remember sitting in the hay with her knees to her chest and her wedding dress dusty, and her heart still hammering from the running and the fear, and the extraordinary, terrifying freedom of the choice she had just made. And then she would hear the kitchen door open and his footsteps on the porch, and she would turn and go back to the morning.